Last week, the respective boards of trustees for Medicare and Social Security released their annual reports for 2018. I mentioned this briefly in a recent wake-up call. As usual, the numbers are pretty gruesome, and the reports plainly stated what I've been talking about and warning about here on the wake-up call for years. The trust funds for both Social Security and Medicare are going to run out of money soon. In the case of Medicare, the trustees project that its largest trust fund will be fully depleted in 2026, just 8 years away. In the context of retirement, that's right around the corner. For Social Security, the trustee report stated that the program will spend more money on benefits in 2018 than it will generate in income and tax revenue. So this year will be the first time Social Security has run a deficit since 1982. But it gets worse. Because according to the trustees' projections, the program will continue running larger and larger deficits until it too becomes fully depleted in 2034. After that, recipients can expect at least a 25% cut in the benefits they were promised and worked their entire lives to receive. Again, these numbers come directly from the trustees of Social Security and Medicare, which includes the U.S. Treasury Secretary. The reports were so dire that mainstream publications picked them up almost immediately. Curiously, though, but typically from these loathsome scum, a number of newspapers tried to play down the bad news, dismissively telling their readers that Social Security and Medicare are just fine and that those sobering projections don't matter. These are common refrains. They'll state, for example, that there's nothing to worry about because the government will step in and bail out the programs. Is that so? Well, who's going to bail out the government? According to the Treasury Department's annual financial report, Uncle Sam is already insolvent to the tune of $20.4 trillion, and those numbers are only going to get worse. Treasury's own projections show annual budget deficits in excess of $1 trillion starting in 2020. Simply put, a short-term fix of Social Security and Medicare would cost trillions of dollars, which would just be a down payment on the long-term costs of fixing the programs. The federal government simply doesn't have that kind of money. Not even close. So the expectation that some politician is going to come riding in on a white horse with checkbook in hand is ludicrous. A second commonly held myth is that these Social Security and Medicare projections are irrelevant because they have a history of being wrong. That's completely untrue. 35 years ago, the Social Security annual report from 1983 projected that the program's cost would exceed its income and tax revenue in 2020. The current report states that this is going to happen in 2018. That's only a 2-year difference from what they projected over 3 decades ago. So they pretty much nailed it. More importantly, though, we're not even talking about long-range projections, which typically look 50 to 75 years in the future. We're talking about 8 years from now. But even if you take a longer-term view, the data is still grim. Social Security and Medicare provide benefits to people based primarily on tax revenue generated by those who are currently in the workforce. Essentially, the programs require a certain number of workers paying into the system for every single retiree withdrawing benefits. They call this the worker-to-retiree ratio. In order for this delicate balance to work, population growth has to remain fairly stable. Major swings in population growth throw everything out of whack. The critical problem is that both fertility rates and population growth, which takes into consideration immigration and mortality, have been declining. The US fertility rate has been on a general downward trend since 1990 and in steep decline since 2007. Overall population growth rates for the past several years have been the lowest in more than 5 decades. This contrasts with the years immediately following World War II, in which there was an explosion in population growth. Those are the ones currently receiving Social Security and Medicare benefits. But due to the declines in population growth, there are no longer enough workers paying into the system, even with unemployment at multi-decade lows, to support the program's current recipients. The end result is what we're talking about today. Social Security and Medicare can't physically generate enough revenue to support their costs and will thus soon deplete their cash reserves. The government is trying to put a brave face on this, telling us that the alarming drop in the national fertility rate is only temporary, even though it's been falling steadily for 3 decades. But they insist it will reverse soon. Frankly, it doesn't seem sensible to plan one's retirement based on the ability of these bureaucrats to predict accurately how much unprotected sex people are going to be having in the coming years. Instead, let's look at the big picture. Social Security and Medicare are both perennially mismanaged with a history of gridlock and inaction. The people who are responsible for overseeing these trust funds have clearly stated that the programs will run out of money and be unable to pay the benefits that have been promised. What sane person would possibly put all of his or her retirement eggs in that basket? The social welfare systems that are responsible for 40% of federal spending are growing broke. Maybe you read this headline from the Wall Street Journal. Social Security expected to dip into reserves this year. What reserves? Oh yes, the trust fund. But what's in the trust fund? US Treasuries, what else? In other words, the people's favorite pension plan will depend on US Treasury bonds, IOUs from the deepest debt hole in the world, the same IOUs that the world's biggest central bank, the Fed, is unloading through quantitative tightening. These are the same IOUs that the federal government is selling too in record numbers. Deficits must be covered by borrowing, i.e. selling bonds. In fiscal year 2019, the Feds are going to need to sell $1.2 trillion worth of them. Meanwhile, corporate America has some $7 trillion worth of bonds maturing over the next 7 years. It will have to roll them over by issuing new debt. Who is going to buy all this debt? At what price? Well, I'll talk about that another day. Meanwhile, Medicare is looking a little peaked too. Its so-called trust fund is expected to be depleted by 2026, 3 years sooner than the last estimate. Here's the important number, says the Fiscal Times, 2.2. That's the ratio of workers to Social Security beneficiaries. In 1968, when America really was great, there were about 5 workers for every 1 beneficiary. By 2035, that ratio will have fallen to 2.2. I know what you're thinking. 2035 is a long time from now. Hey, many of us listening to this or announcing it will not see it. So, that gives Congress and the administration plenty of time to correct any problems, right? The US government now consumes about a quarter of the national output and directs, controls, or strongly influences another quarter. How does it make its decisions about when to spend and when to cut back? If it works the way they teach you in civics class, we have nothing to worry about. If their finances begin to go bad, your elected representatives, paragons of virtue and intelligence, every one of them, will take action to set things straight. They're smart people. Many of them have law degrees. Some have even been in business. In a pinch, they'll sharpen their pencils, tighten spending, raise taxes, and put their house in order. But this isn't civics class.